He wasn't born in France, he wasn't born into power, and yet, he rose to command an empire that would redraw the map of the world. This is the story of a man whose ambition was as vast as the continent he sought to conquer, Napoleon Bonaparte. The story begins not in the gilded halls of Paris, but on the rugged island of Corsica in the town of Cho. Here, in 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte was born into a family of minor nobility. His father, a lawyer deeply involved in Corsican politics, secured for his son a future he himself could only dream of, a military education in mainland France. But this new world was not a welcoming one. In the academies of Brienne and Paris, the young Corsican was an outsider. Mocked for his accent, his modest background, and his fierce, brooding intensity, he found solace not in friendship, but in books. He devoured histories of great commanders, from Alexander to Caesar, nursing an ambition that grew in the shadows of his isolation. This crucible of loneliness and intellectual rigor forged a will of iron, a mind sharpened for strategy, and a relentless desire to prove his worth to the world that had scorned him. Little did anyone know, the very revolution that would tear France apart was about to create the perfect stage for his ascent. As France descended into the chaos of revolution, the old order crumbled, creating a vacuum of power and opportunity. For a talented and ambitious young officer in the artillery, it was a time of unprecedented possibility. While others fell, Napoleon rose. His first true test came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon, where royalist rebels, supported by British ships, had seized the vital port. With brilliant tactical insight, he identified a key position to place his cannons, forcing the British fleet to withdraw and securing a stunning victory for the Republic. He was no longer just a soldier, he was a hero. His reputation grew with each success. When a royalist mob threatened to storm the government in Paris in 1795, it was Napoleon who was called upon to defend the Republic. With a whiff of grapeshot, his cannons dispersed the insurrectionists, saving the Directory and placing him at the very center of French political power. What came next would change Europe forever. Given command of the beleaguered army of Italy, he transformed a starving, disorganized force into a lightning-fast instrument of conquest, winning a series of dazzling victories against the Austrians. Napoleon wasn't just a general, he was a master of propaganda, carefully crafting an image of himself as a victorious savior. His dispatches from the front were read to rapt audiences across France, but his ambition soon looked beyond Europe. The Egyptian campaign of 1798, while a military misstep, was a political masterpiece. Despite being cut off by the British Navy, he presented himself as a bringer of enlightenment to the East. Hearing of political instability back home, he abandoned his army and made a daring return to France, where the people, hungry for a strong leader, greeted him not as a failure, but as their long-awaited messiah. The stage was set for his boldest move yet. In the coup of 18 Brumaire, he seized power, ending the revolution and becoming the most powerful man in France. As first consul, and later as emperor, Napoleon embarked on a sweeping project of reform that would shape the modern state. He centralized the government, reformed the economy, and established a new system of education. His most enduring legacy from this era was the Napoleonic Code, a revolutionary legal framework that enshrined principles of equality before the law, property rights, and individual liberty. It was a foundation for civil law that would be adopted across the world. In 1804, in a magnificent ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, a symbolic act that declared his power was won, not inherited. At his side was Josephine, the love of his life, whose inability to provide an heir would later lead to their tragic divorce. At the heart of his empire was the Grande Armée, a colossal military machine built on meritocracy, speed, and devastating new tactics. It was the most formidable force Europe had ever seen, and with it, Napoleon would bend the continent to his will. At the height of his power, he felt untouchable, but fate had other plans. The years that followed his coronation were a whirlwind of military genius. At he encircled and captured an entire Austrian army with minimal bloodshed. At Austerlitz, his masterpiece, he crushed the combined forces of Austria and Russia in a single day of tactical brilliance. Victories at Austerlitz and Wagram followed, shattering the old empires of Europe and placing Napoleon at the zenith of his power. He installed his relatives on the thrones of conquered nations and redrew the borders of kingdoms at will. To cripple his most persistent enemy, Great Britain, he created the Continental System, a massive Europe-wide embargo designed to strangle the British economy. His geopolitical ambitions seemed limitless. To secure his dynasty, he divorced the beloved Josephine and married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor, forging a link to one of Europe's oldest royal houses. By 1811, his empire stretched from the coast of Spain to the borders of Russia. It seemed as though nothing could stop him, but history is never simple, and the seeds of his downfall were already being sown in the scorched earth of Spain and the vast, frozen plains of the east. The first crack in the empire appeared in Spain. What was meant to be a swift conquest devolved into the brutal, draining peninsular war. The Spanish people rose up in a vicious guerrilla campaign, tying down hundreds of thousands of French troops in a conflict that became known as the Spanish Ulcer. But it was Napoleon's hubris that would lead to his greatest catastrophe. In 1812, seeking to force Caesar Alexander I back into the continental system, he assembled the largest European army in history and invaded Russia. The campaign was a logistical nightmare from the start. The Russians retreated, burning their own land and denying the French army sustenance. Though Napoleon captured a deserted and burning Moscow, he had won an empty prize. The brutal Russian winter descended upon the Grande Armée during its long retreat. Starvation, frostbite, and relentless Cossack raids annihilated his forces. Of the more than 600,000 men who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 staggered back. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered. Seeing his weakness, the nations of Europe, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden formed the Sixth Coalition, uniting against him. The war for Europe had entered its final, bloody chapter. Pushed back into France by the combined might of Europe, Napoleon fought a brilliant but hopeless defensive campaign. In 1814, with Paris occupied by Allied forces, he was forced to abdicate. His conquerors exiled him to the tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean. They believed his story was over. They were wrong. For 10 months, he watched and waited as the restored monarchy in France grew unpopular. In a move of breathtaking audacity, Napoleon escaped from Elba and landed on the shores of France with a handful of loyal guards. The soldiers sent to arrest him laid down their arms and joined his cause. His march to Paris became a triumphal procession, as the French people, remembering the glory of the empire, rallied to his banner. He retook the throne without firing a single shot, beginning the period known as the 100 Days. The great powers of Europe, stunned by his return, declared him an outlaw and prepared for one last, decisive conflict. The fate of Europe would be decided on a muddy field in modern-day Belgium, Waterloo. The battle did not go as planned. Heavy rain delayed Napoleon's attack, giving his enemies precious time. Miscalculations and poor coordination plagued the French command. Still, the French army fought with ferocious courage, coming agonizingly close to breaking the British and Allied lines commanded by the Duke of Wellington. But just as victory seemed within reach, the Prussian army, led by Gebhard von Blücher, arrived on the flank. Their assault shattered the French right wing and turned the tide of the battle decisively. A final heroic charge by Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard was repulsed, and the French army collapsed into a chaotic rout. The Emperor's last gamble had failed. The 100 Days were over. This time there would be no second chances. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a remote and desolate rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Here he spent the last 6 years of his life crafting his own legend, dictating his memoirs, and reflecting on his monumental rise and fall. He died in 1821, but his influence did not. From the legal codes that govern nations to the military strategies taught in academies, his impact is undeniable. He was a tyrant and a reformer, a conqueror and a lawgiver, a man whose ambition both created and destroyed. And his shadow still stretches over Europe, even today. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Histalks AI for more deep dive history videos.